It was the most humiliating ordeal of my life. But if this is what I have to endure to prove my innocence, so be it. Before you label or condemn me, don't treat me like a criminal because I am innocent." In the final weeks of his life, Michael Jackson wasn't terrified of a tour flopping. He was terrified of disappearing. He stopped sleeping. He treated his own home like hostile territory. Phone numbers were changed. Rooms were checked. Locks were tested. And one thing began to slip away completely: trust. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and crowds, he started saying something he had never dared say in public. "They're trying to kill me." He didn't describe a single person. Not one anonymous threat. He spoke about something bigger, something organized, something that, in his view, would profit if he never made it to the stage again. This wasn't a meltdown in front of reporters. It was a pattern repeated to the small circle still allowed near him as his body got thinner, weaker, and more dependent on medication. Official documents would later compress everything into a narrative of drugs and negligence. But this file asks what the paperwork left out. Why did Michael believe he was being hunted? And why did no one stop what came next? Chapter 1. Roots of Fear, A Childhood Built on Control 1960 S1970 Seth. Long before Michael Jackson whispered that someone was after him, fear had already taken up permanent residence inside him. It didn't suddenly appear in adulthood. It was wired in early through discipline pressure and a life that never actually belonged to the child living it. The story starts in Gary, Indiana, inside a cramped house where walls were thin, privacy barely existed, and quiet was rare. From the outside, the Jackson home looked like a model of structure and ambition, a tight, focused black family chasing the American dream through talent and hard work. Inside, the rules were rigid. Order was everything. Mistakes had consequences. Childhood, in the normal sense, was something Michael watched other kids have. By the early 1960s, he wasn't treated as just a boy anymore. He was the lead of a product in development, the Jackson 5. His days were carved into strict blocks. Rehearsals swallowed playtime. Performances replaced school routines. Travel erased stability. Adults decided everything: where he stood, what he wore, how he spoke when he smiled. There was always someone watching: a parent, a manager, a producer, a bandmate. Every move had an audience and a critique. Accounts from inside the family describe a system powered by obedience. Mistakes meant punishment. Fear became a tool, used to sharpen discipline and squeeze out perfection. Michael absorbed a lesson that would haunt him for life. Being watched is normal. Being safe means never dropping your guard. As the Jackson 5 began touring the country in the late 1960s, the pressure only intensified. Cheap motels, noisy stages, tour buses, and backstage hallways blurred into one long corridor. There was no such thing as home in the way most children understand it. Cities changed every night. Faces changed every day. Crowds screamed his name. Strangers grabbed at his clothes. Microphones, cameras, flashes, all of it forced him into constant performance. He was never really alone, but he was rarely truly protected. Under those conditions, Michael developed habits that psychologists later described as hypervigilance, a mind that never really rests, always scanning for what could go wrong. He learned to read moods in seconds. The tightening of a jaw, a change in footsteps, a shift in tone. Tiny signals that told him when anger was coming, when he needed to be perfect, when it was safer to become very small and very quiet. Those skills kept him safe. They also trained his nervous system to expect danger. On stage, he was praised. Off stage, the rules snapped back into place. Love felt conditional. Approval was tied to performance. Failure meant consequences, not comfort. Michael learned to link visibility with risk. Being seen meant being judged. Being judged meant being at risk of punishment. Even success felt unstable, because the bar could always move higher. By the early 1970s, he was one of the most recognizable young performers in America. But no one around him was tasked with monitoring his mental state. There were no routine check-ins with child psychologists, no serious questions about what that level of pressure does to a developing brain. The industry kept immaculate records of ticket sales, TV ratings, and chart positions, but not of his emotional health. After shows, Michael often slipped into silence. He avoided open conflict. He rarely expressed anger directly. When adults around him raised their voices, he froze instead of responding. People called it shyness. It looked more like survival. Stillness became his shield. If he didn't move, if he didn't argue, if he didn't push back, maybe the storm would pass. The most damaging part was the absence of a language for what he felt. Nobody around him taught him how to talk about fear. He only learned how to hide it. So he smiled when he was uncomfortable. He sang when he was anxious. He performed while he was afraid. Fear stopped being an event. It became a background noise, constant and visible to everyone but him. There are no childhood reports documenting how often he flinched, how lightly he slept, or how many nights he lay awake, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Those details were never written down. But later behavior suggests they were already there. By the time Michael hit adolescence, trust was already a struggle. He leaned on strict routine and tight control to keep his anxiety from spilling over. Unpredictability made him uneasy. Sudden changes in plan triggered alarm rather than excitement. The world saw a prodigy. What the world did not see was the tension underneath. Michael's early life taught him 3 dangerous beliefs. People in power can hurt you. Love can vanish if you make a mistake. Staying alert is the only way to stay alive. Those beliefs didn't dissolve as he got older. They hardened and moved with him, shadowing every contract, every stage, every room. So later, when he started saying he was being followed, monitored, controlled, those fears didn't appear out of thin air. They matched a world he had been trained to see since childhood, where being visible was never the same as being safe. In the 1960s and 1970s, Michael Jackson learned how to perform under control. He learned how to hide fear inside a perfect smile. He learned how to scan his environment without anyone realizing he was doing it. What he never learned was how to feel safe when the spotlight turned off. And when pressure returned, decades later, through contract scandals and failing health, the same frightened child who had watched every doorway in Gary, Indiana, stepped back to the surface. Only this time there was no real escape route, and no one assigned to protect him from what he believed was coming. When fame becomes a target, power, profit, and pressure. 2001, 2008. In late 2001, Michael Jackson reached a point of power that most artists never even glimpse. That was also when, according to people close to him, the ground under his life began to crack. In November of that year, through a complex series of business moves, Michael secured effective control over Sony/ATV Music, publishing the catalog that held thousands of songs, including a huge portion of the Beatles' work. On paper, it was a business victory. In reality, it rewired how he understood his place in the industry and how he believed the industry now looked at him. From that moment on, Michael stopped feeling like he was just famous. He started feeling like he was exposed. Those in his inner circle describe a subtle but clear shift over the following months. In 2002, conversations in his world turned more and more to ownership, leverage, and control. It wasn't just about making music. It was about holding something others wanted. Fame had always drawn attention. Ownership drew pressure. By early 2003, corporate tension and media aggression formed the new atmosphere around him. Stories became more invasive. Headlines went beyond his art, probing into his private behavior, his home, his children. Michael reacted by retreating. He spent less time in public, moved between properties, and tightened access to his physical space. Friends and staff say he began to question motives behind almost every interaction, interviews, proposals, contract. The question was no longer who likes me, but who profits if I fall. On February 3, 2003, the situation detonated. Journalist Martin Bashir's documentary Living with Michael Jackson aired worldwide. It didn't just spark curiosity. It triggered outrage and suspicion, setting off a storm of commentary and condemnation. Within weeks, the tone in the media shifted from fascination to moral judgment. Later that year, on November 18, 2003, authorities raided Neverland Ranch. Helicopters circled overhead. Police caravans rolled through the gates. The images played over and over on news channels. For the public, it was a spectacle. For Michael, it was a nightmare replay of childhood fear, only now scaled to a global audience. People who were with him at the time described him watching the coverage in stunned silence, hands shaking, turning the TV on and off, as if trying to make the images disappear. The legal process escalated. In 2004, he was formally charged. Court dates in Santa Maria forced him into a new kind of circus, one where every step from the car to the courthouse doors was filmed, repeated, and dissected. Outside, cameras captured his every expression. Inside, his posture told a different story. He clutched documents too tightly. He spoke softly, rarely. At times, he wore masks, saying he worried about germs, but the deeper anxiety was about exposure itself. Each headline felt less like news and more like ammunition. Family and associates later recalled Michael making one particular observation more than once. "If I die, they will make more money." He didn't scream it. He stated it as if he were reading a profit and loss sheet no one else wanted to look at. Media ratings surged during the trial. Old albums sold again. Footage of him walking into court became daily content. It was hard for him not to see a pattern, his worst moments translated neatly into someone else's revenue. On June 13, 2005, he was acquitted on all counts. Legally, the system cleared him. Psychologically, there was no acquittal. He didn't come out of that courthouse restored. He came out convinced that innocence would not protect him next time. He left the United States soon after, spending long stretches in Bahrain, then moving between Ireland, Germany, and Las Vegas. To outsiders, it looked like escape or rest. To those close to him, it looked like exile. Between 2006 and 2008, his distrust hardened. He shut out the media. He grew wary of long-standing industry relationships. Promises and contracts were dissected with suspicion. He stopped talking about individuals and started talking about the machine, the system, the industry. It was no longer about one enemy. It was about a structure he believed could profit from his humiliation or his absence. Meanwhile, something crucial never happened. Despite the trauma of a 2-year global trial and the clear signs of anxiety and exhaustion, there is no public record of a deep, independent psychological assessment afterward. Legal documents tracked charges and verdicts. Medical files tracked physical symptoms. His mental state, the fears, the sleepless nights, the shaking hands, the belief that his worth to others might be higher in death remained unexamined in any official way. By 2008, Michael Jackson was financially squeezed, emotionally hollowed out, and deeply suspicious of many of the people and systems around him. In his mind, the story had already shifted. Fame wasn't a spotlight anymore. It was a scope. If he stayed visible, he felt vulnerable. If he disappeared, he believed others would cash in. Inside that paradox, fear found new structure. So when he later whispered, "They're trying to kill me," those words did not come from nowhere. They came from years of feeling like a publicly traded asset in a system that had already proved it could move on without him, as long as his name stayed valuable. Watched everywhere when fear becomes daily behavior, 2007-2009. What if the most famous man in pop no longer felt celebrated but hunted? By 2007, Michael Jackson wasn't just avoiding scandal. He was avoiding presence itself. The fear that had followed him from childhood was no longer tied only to headlines or lawsuits. It became physical, tied to locations, rooms, and the air around him. Wherever he slept, Michael believed he was not alone. That year he drifted between Las Vegas, Beverly Hills, and eventually Holmby Hills in Los Angeles. Hotels and rented mansions replaced anything that could truly be called home. Each move followed the same sequence: arrive, inspect, withdraw. Assistants and security described a ritual that never changed. Before Michael relaxed, before he lay down or unpacked, the room had to be examined thoroughly. Not just a casual glance, but a sweep. Curtains were pulled tight, sometimes layered to block every line of sight. Lamps were shifted, televisions unplugged, telephones examined like potential weapons. If he saw something that didn't make sense, a blinking light, an unfamiliar cable, a noise he couldn't place, his body tensed immediately. In late 2007, in Las Vegas, one assistant recalled how Michael refused to sleep in a suite until it was changed twice. The explanation he gave was simple and chilling. Someone could hear me breathe. No listening devices were ever found. But the behavior repeated again and again. By 2008, phones had become objects of suspicion instead of connection. Michael rotated phone numbers constantly, sometimes within weeks. Landlines were rarely trusted. Cell calls were short and coded. People who worked with him later said Michael was convinced that calls were being monitored not just by journalists or random eavesdroppers, but by people tied to business and power. He didn't think he was just famous, one bodyguard said. He thought he was exposed. In Beverly Hills, where he stayed intermittently, that exposure felt amplified. Michael avoided windows. He walked the house at odd hours. He slept in fragments, grabbing minutes of rest in the daytime, when the world felt slightly quieter. When he did sleep, it wasn't deep. It was shallow, easily broken by the slightest sound. This created a cruel loop. He was frightened of being alone. He was equally frightened of people being too close. New staff made him uneasy. Long-time staff were questioned. He studied faces and voices, constantly searching for tiny signs that someone might be lying or hiding something. The hypervigilance that began in childhood was now his entire operating system. By early 2009, after moving into the rented mansion on Carrollwood Drive in Holmby Hills, the fear sharpened further. On paper, Carrollwood was secure, private, controlled. In practice, it became the center of his anxiety. Rooms were checked, then checked again. He wanted to know who had keys, who had been inside, who had passed through the property when he wasn't looking. One assistant later described seeing Michael standing alone in the hallway late at night, saying nothing, just listening. Sometimes he asked security guards to stand outside his bedroom door, not because he feared fans storming the house, but because he feared being left unprotected. Then moments later, he'd ask them to leave, worried that having too many people close gave them more angles to reach him. This back and forth defined his days. Doctors noted extreme insomnia and prescribed medication to address it. Medical notes focused on sleep quantity, dosage schedules. What those records did not capture was why he could not sleep. Those around him watched his language shift over time. At first, he said, "They're watching." Then, "They're listening." Eventually, he whispered, "They're trying to kill me." These weren't scripted lines or dramatic outbursts. They were spoken quietly, usually at night, often without detail. When pressed on who they were, Michael rarely named individuals. He spoke instead of systems, forces, people who would benefit if he failed or if he was gone. Psychologists might call this persecutory anxiety, the belief that someone somewhere is actively working to harm you. Whether born from trauma, stress, or medication, it changes how every moment feels. Neutral events become suspicious. Coincidence feels like proof. Yet in the documentation that later surfaced, there is no formal psychological diagnosis attached to Michael's fear. His insomnia was treated. His belief that he was being targeted was never truly addressed. By mid-2009, as this is, rehearsals ramped up, fear and pressure merged. Staples Center demanded a superstar. Carrollwood Drive contained a man who felt cornered. He kept the music on low in the house, not for pleasure but to mask sounds he thought might be surveillance. He instructed assistants to knock in specific patterns so he'd know it was really them. Unexpected noise jolted him awake. Unexpected silence frightened him even more. To the public, posters and promotions announced a legendary comeback. Inside the mansion, Michael Jackson was living like a man under siege. He didn't break in a single night. He wore down over hundreds of nights walking halls, closing curtains, switching phones and whispering the same sentence to anyone he still trusted enough to tell. "They're trying to kill me. This is it." The final pressure, March, June 2009. The countdown began on March 5, 2009, under blinding lights at London's O2 Arena. "This is it," Michael told the roaring crowd. 50 shows. One last run. To fans it sounded like a promise. To Michael, it sounded like a sentence. Once he spoke those 3 words, everything locked into place. Back in Los Angeles, contracts solidified. Insurance clauses kicked in. Schedules turned from flexible to fixed. The announcement triggered an entire machine venues, promoters, ticket sellers, crews, none of which could easily be stopped. For Michael, already in a fragile mental and physical state, it wasn't just a tour. It was a financial lifeline and a public test he felt he could not afford to fail. By early May, rehearsals moved into the Staples Center. The scale was overwhelming. Massive LED screens, moving platforms, dozens of dancers, dozens more technicians. Every person on that floor was there because the world expected Michael Jackson to be Michael Jackson again. Witnesses noticed the contrast immediately. When he arrived, he was polite and soft-spoken, but also thinner, slower, and visibly drained. His movements were precise, but careful, as if he were calculating every step to avoid pain. During run-throughs, he'd stop to catch his breath, one hand resting lightly on his chest or on a mix stand. Between songs, he sometimes sat quietly in a folding chair, eyes closed, hands folded, saving energy. Director Kenny Ortega, familiar with Michael's work ethic, saw the difference. In emails and conversations with producers, he described a man who seemed physically fragile and emotionally worn. These weren't dramatic accusations. They were measured warnings. But a machine built around 50 sold-out shows doesn't respond easily to warnings. The rehearsals rolled on. As days passed, Michael's insomnia grew worse. He arrived tired and left even more exhausted. Nights became battlegrounds. He couldn't turn his mind off. Anxiety about the show, about his body, about the pressure kept him awake. Doctors were consulted not to question whether he should be doing the tour at all, but to make sure his body could keep up. Sleep became something he chased through medication. According to later testimony, he started relying on sedatives strong enough to override racing thoughts and chronic fear. He called one of them milk, a white liquid he believed was the only thing that could shut his mind down. Every night he needed more rest than his body could find. Every morning he needed more strength than his body had left. The cycle tightened. A bad night meant a worse rehearsal. A worse rehearsal meant more fear. More fear meant less sleep. In this loop, medication was not a luxury. It was the only thing standing between him and collapse. By late May, Ortega's warnings became more urgent. He described Michael as underweight and struggling, suggested rest days, and asked for focused medical oversight. But a pause meant risk, financial risk, legal risk, reputational risk. Too many contracts were already in motion. Too much money was already spent. Behind the scenes, whispers grew. Some people worried he wouldn't make it to opening night. Others believed he would push through as he always had. By early June, rehearsals had turned into a kind of endurance test. Michael arrived late, some days quiet and inward. He avoided long conversations. He rehearsed moves in the air as if trying to convince himself his body could still do what his mind remembered. Witnesses recalled moments where he froze, mid-song, placed a hand on his chest, and softly asked for a break. The room would fall silent. No one scolded him. But no one truly stopped the train either. Everything depended on him, and he knew it. He believed that if the shows failed, everything collapsed: finances, reputation, the last shreds of control over his own narrative. So he kept going. On June 23, 2009, he stepped into what would become his final rehearsal. Some people later described it as a good night. He moved better. He smiled more. Clips show flashes of the old electricity, the timing, the presence, the command. To optimistic eyes it looked like a comeback forming. To others it looked like adrenaline, a final surge from a body and mind cornered by deadlines. Nothing fundamental had changed. The insomnia still ruled his nights. The pressure still devoured his days. The schedule still marched forward. This is it, was supposed to be redemption. Instead, it became a tunnel with no exits, only a fixed endpoint that everyone saw coming and no one stopped. The final 70 days warnings without rescue, April-June 2009. The last chapter of Michael Jackson's life did not start on the morning he died. It began in April 2009 inside the mansion at 100 North Carrollwood Drive. By then, one problem overshadowed everything. He could not sleep. Not occasionally. Not for a few nights. This was sustained insomnia, the kind that breaks thought patterns, weakens the body, and magnifies every fear. Staff described him pacing after midnight, drifting from room to room. Curtains stayed closed. Lights were dim and low. He asked the same questions repeatedly. Who's been in here? Who has the keys? Who used the phone? The less he slept, the louder his mind became. By late April, insomnia had become the main crisis. Rehearsals were ramping up. Pressure was peaking. This is it was no longer a distant plan. It was a ticking countdown. This is when Dr. Conrad Murray was brought in to live in the house and provide full-time medical care. Officially, he was there as a personal physician. Practically, he had one primary task: make Michael sleep. According to court testimony, Michael asked specifically for propofol, jokingly calling it his milk. He had been given it before and believed it was the only thing strong enough to switch off his brain. It was never meant to be a home sleep aid. It was meant for surgical rooms, but to Michael, it was a solution. Without it, he feared he'd be unable to perform. And without the performance, he believed he'd lose everything. So a deadly contradiction took control. He was afraid of being medically controlled, but he was more afraid of being awake. Those around him later described nights where Michael begged for rest and at the same time expressed fear about what the drugs might be doing to him. He wanted the effects without the risks, the silence without the danger. During this window, April, May, June, he reportedly began repeating one line over and over in private. "They're trying to kill me." He didn't scream it. He didn't say it in interviews. He whispered it, late at night, to the few people he still trusted. When they asked who, he didn't give a list. Instead, he talked about pressure money and the people who would benefit if he never walked on stage again. By late May, visible warning signs multiplied. He grew thinner. His hands shook when he was exhausted. He sometimes appeared disoriented after trying to sleep. Yet the rehearsals continued. The schedule held. Emails from Kenny Ortega and others expressing concern were logged, acknowledged, and then absorbed into a system that still moved forward. In early June, his sleep depended almost entirely on medication. Mornings were harder. Some days he spoke very little. Others he forced himself into performance mode, insisting he was ready. The mansion felt less like a house and more like a bunker. Quiet on the outside, crowded with invisible tension on the inside. On June 23, the good rehearsal gave some people hope that he was turning a corner. The truth was more cruel. He was running out of time. On June 24, 2009, Michael returned home after what would be his final full day at rehearsal. Still anxious about the show, still unable to sleep naturally, he again sought help from the one person he believed could shut his mind down. In the early hours of June 25, Dr. Conrad Murray administered propofol inside that bedroom. Later that day, at 2:26 p.m., Michael Jackson was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center. The cause: acute propofol intoxication with other medications in his system. Official reports presented a clinical chain drug dosage time of administration. Legal proceedings focused on responsibility inside that single room on that single night. But the night was only the end point. The 70 days leading up to it were filled with visible warnings. A man who could not sleep. A man who believed he was being hunted. A man whose body was failing under pressure while the show around him refused to stop. Those warnings were heard. People saw the weight loss. They saw the exhaustion. They read the concerned emails. They watched his hands shake, his eyes sink, his voice soften. The tragedy is not just that he died. It's that his deterioration was gradual, documented, and still allowed to continue. Outrow hunted or abandoned. In the end, Michael Jackson's story leaves us standing between two deeply unsettling possibilities. One possibility is that brutal pressure, extreme exhaustion, and heavy medication pushed his mind into a state where fear turned into paranoia, something that should have triggered urgent psychological and medical intervention long before his death. The other is that he was right about at least one thing, that the system around him valued the show, the contracts, and the publicity more than his survival, and that his warnings were quietly set aside because stopping the machine would cost too much. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between those two lines. What cannot be denied is this: Michael Jackson repeatedly showed fear. He repeatedly begged for sleep. He repeatedly spoke of being hunted. And still the countdown went on. So the question now doesn't belong to the courts or the contract. It belongs to you. Was Michael Jackson truly being hunted by something organized and invisible? Or was he abandoned by the very people and systems that were supposed to protect him when his fear and his body finally